Hi, everybody, and thanks for staying for the second part of this session. Hang on, I'm losing my mic. 1 second. Okay, hopefully it won't fall off. So I'm going to talk about the Standby Task Force. And the Standby Task Force is a network that I volunteer for. Everybody who works for the Standby Task Force is a volunteer. So actually, in my professional life, I do something completely different to a lot of the people I think at this conference. I work on peace building. I'm not a journalist by training. I do have a data analysis background for whoever was the person who asked the data analyst issue. And so what I will be talking about is a lot of what I do in my volunteering time. Anahi, in her presentation, talked a little bit about the volunteer efforts around the Haiti earthquake. Shortly after the Haiti earthquake, there was also a group of volunteers that got together and worked on an earthquake in Chile, and very shortly after that, on the flooding in Pakistan. And what these volunteers found was that they were basically all the same people. They kind of knew each other, they got to know each other working on these, on creating these crisis maps. And they were just recycling their skills over and over to respond to these crises. So what the Standby Task Force is just a collection of all these people who had started working on crisis mapping platforms, networked on an online platform, a sort of a shared space for all these volunteers to come together, train each other, share their skills, and then be ready to deploy whenever there is a crisis. And so I've put up here the definition that we give ourselves on our blog when people ask us in brief what we do and what we are. And we, as a group of volunteers, we deploy only at the request of an organization. And so the reason we do this is that of course, what we have is basically a bunch of people who are online, who are processing information on a map. We don't have the ability to respond on the ground, and what we want to do is make sure that our information is critical to people who are responding on the ground. So we've created a set of activation protocols that define at what point we will ask our volunteers to engage with a crisis. And this has a lot to do with how usable our information can be and how responsive the organization is on the ground to a crisis. And then we offer this organization that asks for a deployment a set of skills. I've put up the list here that we give to people who ask us about it, including the stuff at the bottom, which says other random tasks on request. We've been asked to pull together spreadsheets. We've been asked to look for the names of schools. We've been asked for all sorts of things that are not covered here. But we have a team that we call the task team that gets given these random tasks. And this list of skills has emerged in sort of an iterative process dictated by the requests that we were getting with people that we were working with, and also by our volunteers exploring new technologies and finding new ways to process data in a crisis that were useful to responders on the ground. The list of skills that you saw up there is also the way that we organize our volunteers. So we have teams that match the lists of skills for data processing that we have. And I thought I'd put up here what a standard deployment of the Standby Task Force looks like. So you've got a number of the teams with the different skills that were listed up there that are doing media monitoring or they're doing geolocation. The report team is a team that whose sole job is to basically take a look at the entirety of a report about an event or a situation and make sure that it makes sense. So read it, make sure that we haven't put anything that doesn't make sense. Maybe make sure we haven't mapped something in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which happens when people are doing things in a rush. So they just are sort of the sense makers. We have a verification team, an analysis team to speak to the data analysis issue, a tech team that manages a lot of the technology that is being used. And then all of this is the Ushahidi platform in this case is in the center because that was the main technology that we were using. So that's more or less, how the teams come together. Or here's another way of saying how the teams come together. Basically, what we have is hundreds of volunteers that are talking to each other on Skype chats, trying to make sense of a lot of data that is coming through both traditional media sources and social media and reports on the ground, and doing a bunch of things to process that data. Sorry. That one, doing a bunch of things to process that data and to make sure that responders can look at it in a useful way. It's organized chaos when we have that many volunteers thrown at data coming in about a crisis. It's also a very flexible and adaptable response to emerging needs on data. And our response is based largely on dividing up the tasks that are needed in order to make a lot of this information usable for responders into different tasks and giving teams autonomy to problem solve. So each one of the teams that you saw in that workflow has the autonomy to find a way to do what they've been assigned to do, and then that all comes together. And I think really the beauty of the Standby Task Force is in the coordinating of all these different volunteers that have different skills to produce one product that a responder has asked for. What we do to try and avoid responders getting too confused by all of these volunteers that have been thrown out a lot of data is to have 1 or 2 focal points for the responder that's asked for the crisis map, and this is what we call our humanitarian liaison team. So if UN OCHA has asked for a map, then they will be given 1 or 2 people to speak to, despite the fact that in the background you might have 800 volunteers working on a particular map. Just to give you an overview of the type of deployments that our volunteers have been involved in, they're basically divided into 3 kinds of deployments. Processing information that relates to a disaster, so this can be earthquakes, it can be a hurricane, things of the sort. Processing information that has to do with a conflict. The biggest of those deployments was one that Anahi gave an example of, which was the Libya crisis map. And also processing information for preparedness. So for preparedness, what I mean by that is this isn't an event that is happening at the moment. This is an organization that is preparing for something that they know is coming, or that is creating a background of information about an area that they think is critical, or an issue that they think is critical. We've used different types of technologies to do this. A lot of it is based on the Ushahidi platform, which is this crisis mapping platform that Anahi showed you a lot of screenshots of. We've also done a couple of deployments doing satellite imagery analysis, where we asked volunteers to geotag satellite images and process the data in that way. We've also done some which were much more basic, that just used spreadsheets or tables, some kind of tabular data to find information for organizations. The biggest one of those was a deployment in collaboration with USAID to try and geolocate a lot of information that they then needed for their poverty alleviation unit. So I wanted to put that up here just to give you an idea of the breadth of the different types of events that crisis mapping volunteers can be involved in. And when we say data processing for responding on organizations, which sounds a little bit vague, this is actually what we mean. We mean processing data for USAID when they're doing poverty alleviation work. We mean processing data for UN OCHA when they're trying to get contextual information on the conflict in Libya. We mean processing data for UNHCR when they are trying to respond to the drought and famine in Somalia. So it's this kind of thing that we're working on. I guess I just wanted to finish by basically giving a few thoughts on why we started this community of volunteers. And then also perhaps some of the concerns that have emerged as we develop the community of volunteers. Anahi touched on this. The question isn't, should we be using the information, or should people be given the ability to provide information in times of crisis? The fact is that these tools are there, and people do in fact communicate during times of crisis. And so the question really is how are you going to make use of that, or are you just going to not listen to it? We found that volunteer mappers can help turn the conversations that are happening into data that is actionable for responders, and that they are available on short notice to fill gaps, and that they can provide responses that are very flexible, and that is the power of a volunteer network in this kind of space. But there are also some pitfalls and some limitations to the volunteer efforts in this space. One is, if someone's not willing to pay for it, is it really a service that responders want? And our answer to this is that volunteer efforts have to be time limited, and they have to include a plan for handing over to an organization that is being paid to do this. And if that handover doesn't happen, it means that this is not a product that the responding organization values, and it should just be dropped. There's only a certain amount of time that it makes sense to have volunteers working on anything. The second question is an issue which I think is very relevant to this conference in particular, which is around verification. So is the data collected by volunteers really trustworthy? as Anahi mentioned, the Standby Task Force does have a series of verification protocols, and I think we'll talk more about that in the discussion. But in general, what we've found is because you have volunteers that are doing verification that are not trained journalists, all of them, or not trained humanitarian responders, often a simple verification protocol is the best thing that you can have. So something that just says, listen, we think these are our trusted sources. Can you just tag anything that has these trusted sources, and we will do the rest later. So in terms of the volunteer efforts in verification, that's kind of been our experience. The third thing is basically how much processing or analysis of the data should volunteers do. We often get the answer to a crisis map or to in particular to the sort of Ushahidi type crisis map. That's just a bunch of red dots. What am I supposed to do with this? Particularly from humanitarian responders who have very little time. I imagine it's similar with journalists working in newsrooms that are moving very fast. And so we have tried with a number of organizations to make the information more usable by creating summaries and creating narratives out of the information that we were hearing. But having volunteers do that kind of job means that you have to ensure that the responding organization trusts the subjective analysis of the volunteers. And that's not always worked out for us so well. Some organizations trust the volunteers to analyze and some others don't. And then finally, there are some ethical standards for managing information, particularly when it comes to responding to in a conflict environment. And we've gone some way as an organization in creating some ethical standards for our volunteers, in thinking about the conflict sensitivity of our deployments, and sometimes deciding that the best way to deal with ethics is to say no to getting involved in collecting data in certain situations. So I hope that was a useful overview of what we do, and I look forward to the discussion later.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. Quite a similar idea in many ways, but we're doing crisis mapping from the point of view of creating the very basic base maps that you tend to need as a reference for other data to be laid on top. So street maps, essentially. Well, although we do put other types of data in, not just streets. So I need to explain quite a lot, really, about what OpenStreetMap is. Now, this is a large online collaboration. It's a crowdsourcing thing. I actually kind of dislike the term crowdsourcing applied to OpenStreetMap. In a similar way to Wikipedia, actually, it's more of a mass collaboration. It's thousands of people coming together on the internet to try and build something great. In this case, a free map of the whole world. So it's not entirely focused around humanitarian stuff, actually. The motivation came initially in the UK and spread across Europe as well, of trying to free up map data, create open licensed map data. So this project existed already, and the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team is kind of a humanitarian application of it. So let me explain a little bit more about OpenStreetMap. It's a large community. We've got 700,000 registered users, and we are doing crowdsourcing to some extent because we're trying to make the map editing process very, very simple so that people can just chip in and make a very simple contribution. So the editing system for editing the map is kind of a stripped down version of a GIS system, a geographical information system. The outputs from all of this, of course, is a map. So we have a map if you go to OpenStreetMap.org, and you can see that anywhere in the world, including here in Amsterdam, for example. You can see the maps that the community here have created. But actually, more fundamentally, it's not about just displaying a map display on OpenStreetMap.org, but releasing the raw map data with an open license, which is quite an unusual thing, really, within commercial map providing companies. Generally, the raw map data is either hidden away completely, or licensed at great cost. So that's OpenStreetMap, and I would stress that OpenStreetMap itself is a good cause organisation. So if you're interested in this, do have a look on the website and see if you can contribute in some way. But we're talking here about humanitarian mapping, so these kind of three categories: disaster response, and development mapping the developing world, just generally creating perhaps the first maps in a particular part of the world. There's another category sneaked in there, the disaster risk reduction, so that's where there's predicted to be a disaster, trying to create maps in those areas ahead of time. So we saw earlier a video of the Haiti map getting built up. So white flashes on the animation are showing where the edits were happening. I've got here just a set of slides showing a patch of the Haiti map as it developed. So starting off with a very basic road network. That data was actually in there before the earthquake, so we did have some data. And you can see it's just a basic road map. But shortly after the earthquake, people sort of pounced on this part of the map and tried to contribute and add more and more detail. And at the end there, you see the little campsite symbols appearing. That's trying to put the positions of the displaced people where they're camping in the streets, all of which was visible in the aerial imagery. So really the achievement there was to create a good street map and made it really quite fast. So within about 48 hours we had this level of coverage. Meanwhile, other map providers, like Google Maps, for example, really they hadn't changed their map at all in response to the earthquake. So it was a very rapid response brought about because we had this open mapping platform in place already, because people could go in and chip in and join in to map this part of the world. But the exciting thing about it really is the way this got used. So we've seen Ushahidi actually as an example a few times already, and that's just one example of a website bringing in OpenStreetMap and using OpenStreetMap as the base layer before laying other types of data on top of it. So it's that kind of base mapping that I'm talking about. Other more kind of temporary data can be laid on top using these JavaScript overlay type approaches, the web map mashup sort of thing. But more exciting than that, it got used in Haiti on the ground. So here we see people printing out the OpenStreetMap maps because they were the best maps available of the area. And they were being put up in control rooms in tents, and they were being given to people driving supply trucks and this sort of thing. So all of that helped to make the aid effort a little more efficient, perhaps helped to save some lives. But this example is my favorite of all. This is an actual search and rescue team guy who has loaded the OpenStreetMap data onto the whole team's Garmin units. The vector data, because it's open data, it's been converted into different formats, and you can load it onto different types of devices. So here's a Garmin unit with the raw vector data loaded on, taken as an update that day, and the search and rescue teams went and explored the streets of Haiti using that. And we got this quite impassioned message of thanks for doing that, which was very gratifying when that came in, because it's quite easy to contribute to these projects sitting at home in your bedroom and not really know whether it's going to get used. So when you see a message like that, you really know that you're not messing around with some hippie idea. It's actually perhaps helping save lives. So that's the HOT in a nutshell, and OpenStreetMap very quickly. There's obviously quite a lot more I can tell you about how OpenStreetMap works. So perhaps we can do that in the questions.
Working? Yes. Okay, we don't have a lot of time. We have like 15 minutes, right? Is that right? Do I have 15 minutes? Okay, so I have like tons of questions that I wanted to ask you. I'll just ask one and then see if people have other questions. But what is fascinating to me, and I've been working with volunteers for some time now, is kind of like when we are talking about using crowdsourced information, either, you can call it crowdsourced or not, but in a kind of way using, people or user-generated content, either to create a base map or to create if you want, an instances map, right? Like incidents map during an emergency. We're not just dealing with, as a journalist, you want to verify information because of your credibility and because of the information that you're spreading around. We're talking about something that it's even more complex, which is if someone is going to act on wrong information, you risk to put people in danger in an already dangerous situation, which is a humanitarian crisis. So how does kind of like, I think that this is bringing us to the problem of, how do you deal with the difference in between professionals that, have been doing GIS kind of mapping for a very long time, they know exactly how to geolocate things, they know exactly, for example, how to read satellite imageries and extract data from satellite imageries, and, whoever in his living room going online and, edit a map online. And the same thing for like what the Standby Task Force does, right? 800, 900 volunteers online taking random tweets from the internet and putting them on a map and saying to UN OCHA, oh, here something is happening, you should send food there, or you should send someone to respond to that specific need. I don't know who wants to start.
Shall I go first? Or you wanna?
Yeah, well, I think it's quite interesting to look at how professionals interact with OpenStreetMap. I've just come back from a cartography conference, actually, and I guess some of the journalists will be heartened to know that cartographers are struggling with this same kind of issue of their income source being challenged by social contributions, and I think really what you have to remember is that it's creating a whole new bunch of skill sets around these different data sets. So there's professional cartography based on OpenStreetMap now, designing the styles, the ways of rendering OpenStreetMap. And then there's a lot of technology skill sets around creating the tools for Ushahidi and this kind of thing, a lot of JavaScript skills and this kind of thing. And the people that are contributing to OpenStreetMap are, of course, some of those are professionals. So you get a lot of university PhD students will be researching it at the same time as contributing to these projects. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities being created by this, as well as destroying a few business models in the process.
How do you guys, for example, verify the information in the Haiti earthquake? I mean, we're talking about, you said 48 hours. I mean, by the time any information is uploaded on the map and someone is using it, let's say a humanitarian, response organization, how are you sure that that information is actually reliable?
I suppose there's two answers to that. One answer is that it doesn't need to be very accurate or reliable. It's better to have a base map than no map at all. So that if there was no map before, which was the case in fact, then you've created something very useful. But we do follow a wiki approach to validation and improvement of the accuracy of the data. So the data's out there and then other people can edit it. And generally what we find is that the more people looking at an area of the map, the more kind of refined the accuracy will become. So even though a user later on might be making it less accurate, on the whole, the effect of people piling on there and chipping away at it will refine the accuracy. I don't know if you have parallel experiences with the kind of data sets.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to give a very different answer to what you've given. I think with OpenStreetMap, you have something very concrete that you're looking at, and ultimately what you're trying to get at is a very concrete answer. This road runs this way, yes or no. Whilst a lot of the information that we deal with is a lot more subjective, and a lot harder to verify, and perhaps a lot closer to the kind of verification that journalists do. And so generally our approach has been much more that we're not trying to tell OCHA where to deliver food, or we're not trying to tell any of the responding organizations exactly where they need to go. What we are indicating is you need to ask more questions about this thing. So for example, to give an example from the Libya crisis map, there was a situation where we were getting a lot of reports of border crossings into Tunisia, and suddenly we stopped getting reports of border crossings into Tunisia. Now, we didn't know exactly what was happening, but there were a few reports out there about a road being blocked. And so I remember we sent a message to one of the humanitarian responders saying, listen, you need to ask a question about this. We don't know whether this is true, but you certainly need to ask a question about it. So we might not be in a position. I liked what some of the speakers in the previous panel were saying about, the verification skills of a journalist are still the verification skills of a journalist. And I agree with that. And a lot of our volunteers don't have those skills. But they do have critical analytical skills. And they can say, listen, you need to ask this question. Now, we might not know how to answer it, but you journalists do. Or you, OCHA, do need to ask this question. So perhaps my answer is we can't absolutely verify, but we can point to where people need to look at questions.
Interesting. Are there any questions from the audience?
I have a question. You mentioned you ruin somebody else's business models. Which one? The question was, Harry mentioned ruining somebody else's business models. I was just wondering who they're up against.
Well, the business model we were really going after was the UK mapping agency Ordnance Survey. They license their data at great expense, so you can't get hold of the raw underlying data that makes up the maps. And in fact, you can't get hold of a sort of a raster view of the maps without paying some license costs. They're really very strict about it as well. So that was the frustration, actually, that OpenStreetMap was born out of. I think within the humanitarian sphere, there isn't a great deal of that going on. So we're not really destroying anyone's business model there. But certainly governments and mapping agencies in the developed world creating maps is something that we're trying to break down and release free data for.
can ask you a question? Yeah, my name is Marike Ganersen and I work for Open for Change. I have a question. How do you decide on which area you're going to work? Is it you together? Is it because, for example, Doctors Without Borders or somebody else comes to you and asks you that question? Because we get approached these days by different aid agencies who are, yeah, how can we find those crowdsources? I mean, yeah. So I was wondering, how do you decide?
I think it's for both of you, the question.
Yeah, I mean, we wait to be approached is the answer, and we have a set of activation protocols that are available on our blog, and there's an activation page on our blog that has both a contact email address and also basically an activation form that you can fill out and send. It's true that also there's a lot of there's a personal network, so sometimes that it might not come directly through that official activation protocol. Maybe somebody says, hey, do you know anybody who can help on this? And then they get pointed to us eventually. But we do wait to be approached, yeah.
And for OpenStreetMap, the answer is quite different there because we've got the mapping platform in place, so anyone can chip in at any point on any part of the world to create a map. So actually, it is just a case of anyone anywhere in the world starting to create the base map after an earthquake in a particular area, for example. In Haiti, for example, it was some people in Japan were the first to edit the map after the earthquake. That's just the way it worked out. I think we are trying to build activation protocols as well within HOT, but it's quite important for us not to be a bottleneck to that process and allow the volunteer community of OpenStreetMap to all pile in and do their thing of responding quickly. In terms of how you could request our help, that's very much something that the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team is trying to be an organisational front that you can contact by email to request help.
A simple question. From where do you get your source data? Is that aerial photography or satellite imagery? And for instance, in the case of Haiti, I've heard that all the imagery was given out freely at that time. So a question like the previous one, where do you start?
Yeah, the imagery we have actually, at the time we had imagery provided by Yahoo, and that's just an agreement we have throughout the whole of OpenStreetMap, throughout the whole world, that we can use Yahoo's imagery to create a derived vector data set for OpenStreetMap. So we had that agreement with Yahoo, and we've now got a similar agreement with Bing. And Bing generally has better imagery, so we're using that. So that's kind of the base data that we have available as far as aerial imagery goes. And in fact, in quite a lot of the world, there's no high-resolution imagery on the Bing map. So imagery is a problem, essentially, and we're working with the space activation. I forget the name of it. Yeah. We can request imagery from various organisations for humanitarian purposes. So HO2 is involved in doing that, and there are a few other providers. Actually, with Haiti, it was quite an interesting one because those processes hadn't actually been set up and the need hadn't been recognised at that time. We did get hold of various sets of imagery, and part of the OpenStreetMap community, various people within the OpenStreetMap community were able to rectify the imagery and chop it up into tiles and some of the very technical processes that need to happen to get the imagery into the OpenStreetMap editors. Luckily, there were skilled people within the OpenStreetMap community who were able to do that. I'm not sure if you have anything else to add on sources.
I mean, we've done a couple of deployments that use satellite imagery and have been given it for free for the purpose of that deployment. I think when there's a humanitarian crisis, it's quite a compelling argument to make that they should make that imagery available for free. So.
We do have a problem as well because of the nature of open licensing. OpenStreetMap is quite liberally licensed, and there is no non-commercial clause in there. In other words, you can use it for commercial purposes, and this can create a problem actually for humanitarian mapping because various imagery providers, for example, or people who have data already that we could import, we sometimes find that we can't work with that because they want to put a non-commercial clause on that. which is kind of unfortunate. Sometimes end up having to not work with these sources.
I have a question for Harry. When we saw the images coming from the Haiti map being built up, you could see that as more and more things get added to it, it becomes more and more detailed and more complicated. Is there a risk that the maps could become too complicated and lose their usefulness?
Yeah, it's actually a very common criticism of OpenStreetMap that the maps are cluttered. There's too much information on there. But because we do this thing of releasing the raw data, in fact, other people can create different rendering styles of OpenStreetMap. And that's really one of the fundamental freedoms we're trying to create. People can take the raw data, design their own style, and drop some of the detail. So a common one, for example, would be to not show the buildings and not show the land use colouring in the background, and just show the road layout, and you end up with a much more simplistic style. Or there's styles which are specially designed for printing out, for example.
If there's no other question, I have a last question, which is, you briefly touched on that. But one of the big issue that I'm also finding myself dealing with, specifically with media and with journalists, is who owns the crowdsourced data, right? One point, you start collecting information, and this information can become extremely valuable in certain situations. We see with like satellite imageries or mapping tools. See, for example, Google has a completely different model for using Google map makers, right? They collect data, they use it through crowdsourcing, but then the data belong to Google, and it's a part of their commercial kind of like strategy, right? And the same thing is, you know, if you look at crisis mapping, right? You collect all sort of data from social media. Data has been put out by people individually that want to put out this kind of information, but that this information is used by other people. Is there no business model behind it? There cannot be a business model behind it? Or, you know, what is that we have to look at? Because it will become increasingly a problem, and it is in a kind of way increasingly a problem. I see, for example, a lot of the discussion going on in between OpenStreetMap and Google Map makers about, you know, you are creating, you know, you're using user-generated content to make money out of it, and OpenStreetMap is, you know, free license and blah, blah, blah. But on the other side, if you don't have the resources to use OpenStreetMap, Google offers you the resources for free. So where are we going in that? Is, you know, is everything has to be completely kind of like, you know, open and nobody really owns it? Or we're going to find ourselves in the situation where at one point someone needs to own the data. And if they own it, then they can do whatever they want with it.
I don't think we'll find ourselves at a point where somebody needs to own the data. Open licensing is the future, in my opinion, of a lot of things. So transport here in the developed world, if we can release open license transport data, then that will improve transport. And the same goes for map data and pretty much any data, really. And I would actually argue that any crowdsource initiative where you're asking the community to chip in and contribute and build this data set, really, as a moral standpoint, I would say that it should be open data. That's my opinion, and it's probably the opinion shared by most people who contribute to OpenStreetMap. Of course, crowdsource initiatives like Google Map Maker would disagree with that. So,
can I add something to that?
Yeah.
You know, you touched on two things, right? You touched on sort of the business model, and then you touched on sort of the ethics of it. You know, people put out information for one purpose, and then it gets reused for another purpose, and it gets, you know, put together in a different way or whatever it is. And I think, you know, the fact that we're saying we don't want to own it for commercial purposes doesn't mean that we're saying we don't want to own it for responsibility and ethical purposes. In other words, it's okay for an organization like OpenStreetMap to take ownership of what is happening and then do an open license on it. Because in fact, what that's saying to you is OpenStreetMap believes this map is correct, to, you know, and has been done with these standards or whatever, following the process of OpenStreetMap, and is licensed in an open way. And I think that part of ownership is important. And it's true also for crowdsourced data that the Standby Task Force is collecting. You know, we have a certain responsibility to the data that we're then putting out. And we're saying, you know, we might have a disclaimer about what we've done with this data, but at the end of the day, it's being measured against the workflows of the Standby Task Force. So that's another way of looking at ownership, which has to do more with ethics than with the business model, I guess.
Okay. Thank you very much, Helena and Harry. I think we can move to the second panel.